At 4:47 a.m., the wind stopped screaming. By sunrise, 24 of his neighbors were dead, and the man they mocked was the only one still warm. For 36 hours the wind had screamed across the Nebraska prairie with a voice that seemed less weather than living fury, rattling walls and tearing at rooflines and hurling ice crystals hard enough to strip paint from wood. Then at 4:47 on the morning of January 13, 1888, it simply stopped. Henrik Anderson opened his eyes in the darkness of his half-buried home and heard nothing but his wife's breathing beside him and the soft pop of embers settling in the fireplace. He rose, lit the lamp with steady hands, and touched the earthen wall beside their bed. It was cool beneath his palm but not cold. Never cold. The interior temperature held at 68 degrees, the same warmth that had sustained them through the entire storm while outside the world had frozen solid. Ingrid stirred the porridge while Henrik pulled on his boots. Through the small south-facing window he could see the first gray light revealing a landscape transformed into something ancient and pitiless. Snow had drifted in waves 10 feet high against anything that stood vertical. The wooden buildings of Whitmore's Landing, 2 miles east across the rolling hills, were dark. Some showed shattered windows. Others leaned at angles that meant structural failure. One, he counted twice to be certain, had simply vanished, swept away or collapsed into splinters too small to see from this distance. Smoke rose from only 3 chimneys where 20 had burned 2 days before. He touched the wall again, remembering his father's hands guiding his own through the same motion in the mountains above Bergen. Trefot Ned, gut. 3 feet down. Winter cannot reach there. His father had been teaching him to build the turf houses that had sheltered Norwegian families for 1,000 years, homes that grew from hillsides rather than standing against them, that borrowed the earth's constant temperature rather than fighting to create their own. Henrik had been 14. His father had been 47. Neither of them knew that in 18 years Henrik would be standing in America, proving those lessons against a storm that would kill 235 people across the Great Plains. But 18 months earlier, those words had earned him nothing but laughter. The town meeting in August of 1886 had drawn every landowner in Whitmore's Landing to the new municipal hall, a structure that smelled of fresh pine and civic pride. Henrik had stood before the council with his hat in his hands and his building plans drawn on butcher paper, describing the home he intended to construct on his 160 acres of rolling prairie 2 miles west of town. Half buried into a south-facing hillside. Walls of stacked sod 3 feet thick. Small windows. A single chimney. 18 by 24 feet of interior space that would remain a constant 55 degrees year-round with minimal heating. Charles Whitmore had listened from his seat at the center of the council table, gold watch chain gleaming in the lamplight, mustache trimmed to Eastern precision. His own mansion was nearing completion on the highest point in town, 3 stories, 14 rooms, floor-to-ceiling windows on every wall. The architect had come from Boston. The materials had traveled by rail from Chicago. The final cost would reach $12,000, a sum Whitmore mentioned frequently and with visible pleasure. He let Henrik finish his explanation before speaking. "You propose to live in a hole in the ground like an animal." The room shifted. Someone coughed. Henrik kept his eyes steady. "I propose to build as my people have built for 1,000 years, Mr. Whitmore. The earth maintains temperature. It requires no fuel. It proves," Whitmore interrupted, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man whose bank account matched his certainty, "that you misunderstand what civilization means. We came to this territory to build upward, Anderson. To create cities. To prove that modern engineering has conquered the frontier." He gestured toward the window, where his mansion rose against the evening sky. $12,000 demonstrates what progress looks like. Your hole demonstrates what failure looks like. The laughter started scattered and grew synchronized. Henrik felt heat climb his neck but kept his voice level. "We'll see what winter proves." Pastor Edmund Gray stood with the careful gravity of a man who needed to appear wise without committing to anything dangerous. "Perhaps Mr. Anderson will learn by observing proper construction." The Lord gave us dominion over the earth, not instruction to burrow into it like moles. Thomas Whitmore, 19 and eager to earn his father's approval, spoke from the back. The mole's hole. That's what we should call it. The crowd erupted. The name stuck before Henrik reached the door. September arrived with warm winds and clear skies, perfect weather for construction. Henrik began excavating into the hillside he had chosen for its southern exposure and gentle slope, digging down 3 feet before he started building upward. At that depth the soil maintained a constant 50 degrees regardless of surface conditions, a geothermal stability his father had taught him to trust absolutely. He cut sod into blocks 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, 6 inches thick. He stacked them with the practiced precision of the stonemason he had been in Norway, creating walls that grew denser and more insulating with every layer. The design was deceptively simple. An 18 by 24 foot rectangle dug 3 feet into the earth, with walls rising another 7 feet above grade. The southern wall featured 2 small windows, each measuring 24 by 18 inches, large enough for light, small enough to prevent heat loss. 8-inch diameter cottonwood beams supported a roof covered with 12 inches of sod, sloped gently to shed water. The floor was packed earth, worked until it held the hardness of concrete. The fireplace sat central, its stone chimney rising through the roof, designed to heat the small space with a fraction of the wood needed for a conventional home. Ingrid whitewashed the interior walls, transforming the space from cave-dark to surprisingly bright, the rough earth reflecting lamplight in warm, shifting patterns. She had been a schoolteacher in Minnesota before marrying Henrik, and she possessed both his stubbornness and an appreciation for engineering that made her education worthless to the town's estimation. She planted wildflowers on the southern roof slope. She hung curtains in the small windows. She never once called it the mole's hole. By October they were sleeping inside. The first cold snap dropped nighttime temperatures to 20 degrees. The interior held at 55 with a fire so small Henrik could have cupped it in his hands. He lay awake listening to the profound quiet that 3-foot walls provided, wind outside reduced to a distant whisper, and understood with absolute certainty that he could survive anything. 2 miles away, Whitmore's mansion blazed with lamplight from windows large enough to frame entire rooms. November brought the completion celebration, an event that drew families from 3 counties to witness the triumph of civilization over wilderness. The Whitmore mansion stood magnificent against the autumn sky, white clapboard, black shutters, a widow's walk commanding views across 20 miles of prairie. Inside, 14 rooms flowed into one another with the graceful proportions of Eastern architecture. Mahogany staircases. Imported wallpaper. Fireplaces in every major room. The architect had insisted on thin walls to prevent moisture trapping. Whitmore had doubled the window sizes for grandeur. Neither man had considered insulation necessary for a modern, well-heated home. Charles Whitmore raised his glass in the parlor crowded with guests wearing their finest clothes and newest confidence. Modern science has conquered the frontier. Let those who doubt stand outside in January and reconsider. The toast carried through rooms that smelled of perfume and roasted meat and the particular satisfaction of men who believed their money had purchased immunity from consequence. In the kitchen, women who had never spoken to Ingrid Anderson laughed about the mole's hole. In the study, Pastor Gray worked the phrase into a sermon about those who hide from God's light in the earth. The mockery had evolved from insult to entertainment, repeated to visitors as proof of the town's sophistication. Only old Mary Kowalski, a Polish widow of 68 who lived alone in a sod hut on the eastern edge of town, spoke against the consensus. "My bones say this winter will kill," she told anyone who would listen. When cattle face south for 3 weeks straight, when birds leave a month early, when the air tastes like metal, these are warnings. Whitmore dismissed her with the same genial contempt he showed all superstition. The old world died on the other side of the Atlantic, Mary. We build with reason now. December was mild. January began warm enough that children played outside in shirt sleeves on the 11th. The temperature at 6 in the evening read 38 degrees. Whitmore pointed to thermometers as vindication. Henrik watched the western sky turn a green-black he had never seen before and stacked a fourth cord of wood inside his small home. At 7:14 the following morning, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 4 minutes. The wind hit like a physical blow, arriving with such sudden violence that it shattered windows before people understood they should move away from them. Visibility collapsed to 3 feet. The temperature continued falling, -20, -30, -40 degrees Fahrenheit, while wind speed sustained at 60 miles per hour with gusts reaching 80. Snow that had fallen soft 2 days earlier became airborne razors. The storm turned the air itself into a weapon. In the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town, a 23-year-old teacher named Sarah Whitman made the decision that would kill her and 5 of her students. She attempted to lead them the 100 yards to the nearest house. They died within sight of the building, frozen in positions that suggested they had been running. Their bodies would not be found for 3 days. Across Whitmore's Landing, people ran between buildings and were lost, blinded and disoriented in whiteout conditions that made navigation impossible 15 feet from safety. A farmer froze to death gripping the fence post 8 feet from his barn door, his hands locked in place by cold so extreme it killed in minutes. By noon, 11 people were confirmed dead. 20 more were missing, which meant the same thing. Inside Whitmore's mansion, the failure was structural and total. The massive windows shattered inward, every dollar of decorative glass becoming shrapnel and entry points for wind that howled through all 3 floors. The thin walls, designed for breathability and aesthetics, provided no insulation whatsoever. The interior temperature matched the exterior within 2 hours. The 3-story design created a chimney effect that turned the building into a wind tunnel. The family burned furniture in the smallest upstairs room, huddling together as smoke and cold fought for dominance. Thomas Whitmore watched his feet turn white, then gray, then black. His father held him and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The storm lasted 36 hours without pause. Across the Great Plains, 235 people died. In Whitmore's Landing, 24 froze to death. 19 others suffered frostbite severe enough that they would carry the damage for life. 2 miles west, Henrik added 1 log to his fire and stirred the stew. The interior of the half-buried home held at 65 degrees, warmed by a fire so modest it would have seemed decorative in any conventional house. The 3-foot sod walls absorbed the wind's fury without transmitting it. The small windows lost minimal heat. The earth itself, that infinite thermal mass extending in all directions, regulated the temperature with an indifference to surface conditions that seemed almost supernatural. Henrik used 1/4 cord of wood across 36 hours, less than he would typically burn in 3 winter days. He read aloud to Ingrid from a book of Norwegian poetry. He repaired a broken harness. He cooked meals at their normal times. When the wind screamed loudest, making the chimney moan and the lamplight waver, he placed his palm against the earthen wall and felt its coolness, its absolute stability, its ancient promise that 3 feet down, winter cannot reach. The earth doesn't fight the storm, he said quietly. It simply waits beneath it. At 4:47 on the morning of January 13th, the wind stopped with eerie suddenness. Henrik dressed and began digging through the snow drift that had sealed their door, working upward through 6 feet of compacted white until he broke through to bitter air and pale dawn light. He climbed out and stood on a landscape scoured clean of familiar markers. Bodies were visible in the middle distance, frozen mid-stride. Whitmore's Landing showed smoke from only 3 chimneys. Most buildings stood damaged or destroyed. The silence was immense. Inside the stone springhouse at the eastern edge of town, old Mary Kowalski had survived by wrapping herself in every blanket she owned and burning her furniture. When Pastor Gray found her, she spoke 4 words, the mole's hole. Anderson's place. Thomas Whitmore heard her from across the room. His feet were wrapped in bandages that were already seeping. He stood anyway, gripping the doorframe for support. I'll go. 11 survivors began the 2-mile journey at 8:30 that morning, including Charles Whitmore and Pastor Gray. Thomas led them, navigating by memory through chest-deep snow and air cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. 2 collapsed on the way and had to be carried. The journey took 90 minutes. Thomas Whitmore fell face-first into a drift 200 yards from salvation, close enough to see smoke rising from Henrik's chimney but too exhausted to stand. Henrik saw them coming and opened his door. Warmth poured out like something liquid, carrying the smell of wood smoke and coffee and the earthy scent of the walls themselves. Henrik and Ingrid pulled the survivors inside one by one, stripping frozen clothing, forcing hot broth between chattering teeth, rubbing frostbitten limbs with snow-melted water to restart circulation. The contrast between inside and outside was so extreme it seemed to violate physics, 68 degrees of lamplight and survival impossibly separated from lethal cold by 3 feet of prairie sod. Charles Whitmore, who had not cried since childhood, wept. His hands shook too badly to hold the tin cup Ingrid pressed into them. He stared at the earthen walls, at the small fire barely larger than a candle flame, at the windows no bigger than paintings, and understood that every assumption underlying his $12,000 mansion had been catastrophically wrong. Thomas Whitmore whispered, "How is this possible?" Henrik knelt beside him, checking his bandaged feet with gentle efficiency. "The earth doesn't boast. It just protects." All 11 survived the night. By dawn, Thomas was strong enough to walk. By noon, he was running back to town with news that would transform everything. The exodus began in stages. 32 additional survivors made the journey over the next 6 hours, traveling in groups of 5 or 6, following the trail Thomas had marked. Henrik's 18 by 24-foot home became shelter for 43 people. They slept in shifts. They shared food. Henrik organized everything with quiet capability: rationing, medical care, sanitation, rotation schedules. The space that had been mocked as primitive became the only refuge in 20 miles that functioned. The language changed organically. On the first day, people said, "We're going to the mole's hole," with the desperation of those who had no choice. By the second day it had softened to, "Thank God for the haven." By the third, when it became clear that everyone inside would survive while 24 outside had frozen to death, it became, "Anderson's sanctuary saved us." On January 17th, the weather broke. The temperature rose to 15 degrees, warm enough to make the return journey survivable. The survivors walked back to Whitmore's Landing in daylight, seeing clearly for the first time what the storm had accomplished. 24 bodies. 4 buildings salvageable. Entire lives erased by cold. They gathered in the municipal hall, the only structure large enough to hold everyone who remained. Charles Whitmore stood before them with his feet bandaged and his voice stripped of its former confidence. He spoke without preamble or performance. "I spent $12,000 proving I was civilized. Henrik Anderson spent $12 proving he was wise." The silence that followed was absolute. "I am asking him to teach us to build like he builds. To survive like he survives." Pastor Gray stood slowly, his own frostbitten fingers visible beneath thin gloves. "I praised pride and mocked prudence. God's judgment came with ice, not fire. If you're gripped by this story of preparation and survival, subscribe now, because the vindication is about to become unforgettable." Spring arrived in stages across the transformed prairie. By April, the snow had melted enough to begin rebuilding. The town that rose from the ruins of Whitmore's Landing followed new principles, taught in weekly classes that Henrik conducted in the salvaged municipal hall. Every structure would be partially earth-sheltered. Walls would measure a minimum of 2 feet thick, constructed of sod or stone or both. Windows would be small and south-facing. Root cellars were mandatory. The architectural wisdom of 1,000 years replaced the assumptions of a single prideful decade. Henrik taught without triumph or condescension, demonstrating techniques with the same patience his father had shown him. How to cut sod. How to stack it. How to judge the compression needed for structural integrity. How to position a building to borrow the sun's warmth and the earth's protection. Men who had called him a mole now took notes and asked questions and built homes that would survive the next catastrophe, whenever it came. The official town records were amended. Wherever the mole's hole appeared, it was struck through and replaced with Anderson's Haven. The change was approved unanimously. In November of 1888, Ingrid gave birth to a daughter in the sanctuary that had saved 43 lives. They named her Maria. She was the first baby born in the new philosophy, the first child of a generation that would grow up understanding that true shelter came from working with the land rather than against it. The wisdom spread. 3 neighboring counties adopted Henrik's techniques over the following 5 years. When the winter of 1893 arrived with cold nearly as brutal as 1888, it killed no one in the rebuilt territories. The earth-sheltered homes held their warmth. The small windows preserved heat. The thick walls stood firm. The dead from the previous catastrophe remained the final victims, their loss the price of a lesson the living would not forget. Henrik expanded the original sanctuary into a larger community shelter capable of holding 100 people, still half buried, still drawing its strength from 3 feet down where winter could not reach. He never spoke of being proven right. He spoke only of being prepared. Henrik Anderson died on January 11, 1911, 23 years to the day before the storm that had vindicated him. He was 59 years old. He died in the earth-sheltered home he had built with his own hands, surrounded by his wife and daughter and grandchildren who had never known mockery, only honor. His passing was peaceful. The fire burned low. The walls held their steady coolness. Outside, the prairie wind carried snow that would not threaten anyone who had learned his lessons. The funeral procession included 340 people, every resident of what had become Anderson's Haven. They walked past his sanctuary, which stood unchanged, and gathered in the new church built partially into a southern hillside according to his specifications. Pastor Gray, now 70 and still serving, delivered the eulogy with a voice that carried genuine reverence. He was mocked for digging down. He was honored for thinking deep. The town council voted unanimously to officially rename Whitmore's Landing. Maps were amended. Signs were changed. The transformation from shame to honor became permanent in ink and wood. Henrik's original home was declared a historical landmark, to be maintained in perpetuity as a teaching site and memorial. Every January 13th, families gathered there to shelter together for a few hours, retelling the story to children who needed to understand that wisdom often looks like foolishness until reality delivers its verdict. By 1930, Anderson's Haven had survived 4 catastrophic blizzards with 0 deaths. The earth-sheltered architecture that had been ridiculed as primitive became recognized as brilliantly adapted to prairie conditions. Henrik's technique spread across the Great Plains, taught in agricultural colleges and frontier settlements, saving an estimated 2,000 lives over the next 50 years. Charles Whitmore died in 1905, his feet permanently damaged, his fortune diminished but his legacy transformed. His final will left his entire remaining estate to establish the Anderson School of Practical Building, an institution that would teach earth-sheltered construction to anyone who wished to learn, free of charge, forever. The sanctuary still stands. In winter, visitors step inside and feel the same constant coolness Henrik's father taught him to trust. The fireplace holds the same modest flames. The small windows frame the same prairie light. Modern heating bills for wooden homes in the area average $200 monthly. The sanctuary, now a museum, costs $11. Henrik's gravestone, placed in the cemetery on the hillside above town, carries 5 words carved into Norwegian granite, Han lyttet de Jordan talt. He listened when the earth spoke. And on cold January nights, when the wind screams across the Nebraska prairie with the voice that seems less weather than living fury, smoke still rises from the chimney of a half-buried home where a mocked man proved that the deepest wisdom comes from digging down, not building up.